Hearing, Circuit Court Branch 33 in the form of Washington County is now in session. Honorable Lawrence C. Graham Jr. presiding. Silence is commanded. You may be seated.
Mr. McCann, you may continue.
To complete the court, yesterday I made reference to a 85 minute ago. Again, it's going to be produced a portion on the overhead. There was a question about where that came from. I provided a copy to Mr. Boyle, and I have marked it State Exhibit 29. I'm submitting it.
That's correct.
Doctor, did you by any chance go over your notes with respect to whether or not there was any discussion about whether he preferred sex with them alive as opposed to dead?
I do not believe, sir, that I asked him whether he preferred it alive or dead.
Right.
Doctor, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. You pull the mic up. That's great.
Yes, my answer was I did not ask him whether he preferred to have sex with people alive versus dead.
With respect to Tony Hughes, that's victim number 12, the indication both with communication with the police and communication with counsel is that he did not have sex with Tony Hughes after death. Did he tell you anything to the contrary?
No, he did not tell me anything to the contrary.
With respect to David Thomas, that is another victim, he stated to the police that he did not have sex with this gentleman. Let me briefly quote what he said. He states he approached him with the same line. This was in a street corner on section 5, page 29. He states he approached him with the same line, and when they got to his apartment, they drank and talked, but didn't have any sex because he wasn't his type. He states that he killed him because he had already given this individual the potion, and after doing that, he did not want sex with him, and he thought this individual would wake up and be pissed off at him, so he killed him. Later on, apparently he made a statement to counsel indicating that he did have sex. He didn't make that to the police, but from the report submitted through counsel, he indicates he did have sex with him. Did you discuss David Thomas in particular with the defendant, and what, if any, sexual contact he had with David Thomas?
I don't believe I asked him that specifically. I had asked him in kind of review about numbers of people he hadn't had sex with, and my recollection was that the last thing he told me on that was it was only one that he hadn't had sex with after death, but I did not go in it name by name.
Would you turn to page 211?
Again,
State Exhibit number 27.
211.
That hasn't been received. Why don't we have it received? We move. I think I marked it. I moved that it be received in the evidence.
The exhibit number is what?
27. It's the DSM 3R manual.
Any objection, Mr. McCann?
None, Your Honor.
It's received.
Page 211 at the bottom portion is psychotic disorder not otherwise specified. That's 298.90 in terms of enumeration of that system. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You've discussed in your differential diagnosis, you considered certain other possibilities, and you did mention psychoses as one of them.
Yes, sir.
Did you consider this psychotic disorder not otherwise specified?
Yes, sir. In fact, I'm aware that one of the other doctors that Mr. Boyle asked to come in, Dr. Wallstrom, made that diagnosis. But as I said earlier, I call it as I see it. I considered it, and I was not able to come to that same conclusion.
In our discussion yesterday, you referred on at least one occasion to what you observed in the defendant as a cancer of the mind. That was a statement, what we call an analogy. You're not talking about physically discovering any type of cancer in his mind. Am I right?
Well, first of all, cancer would be in the brain and not in the mind. I think I explained that one of my patients had used that term and talked about how he wished that somebody could cut that cancer out of his mind. But you're absolutely right. I'm not talking about the brain physically. I'm talking about the mind as subjective experience.
There were certain physical tests conducted of the defendant defendant, at the request of court doctors, you were provided that information, were you not?
Yes, sir.
And that did not give evidence of any particular physical brain injury. Am I correct on that?
That's correct. He had a CAT scan, he had chromosomal testing, had various hormones and so on. There was not evidence on those tests of biological pathology.
Did you rely in any way on the military information that was supplied to you? First, was such information supplied to you of his military experience?
Yes, sir.
Did you rely in any way on that?
I don't think that that was particularly relevant to the conclusions I came to here. I certainly did read it and considered what I was reading and whether or not it was applicable.
The defendant, in one of his statements, in his statement to one of our psychiatrists, indicated that the Cruz information, the information that had been provided by a man named Cruz in the military, was not true. That was at least a page or a page and a half report, single space, as I recollect. Did you and he discuss that material in particular?
Is this the man that said he'd come back bleeding on a particular night and so on? No, I was aware of that. I was obviously concerned whether there might have been other killings beyond what had been reported, but additional killings would not likely have changed my mind. And so I knew it was there, but it didn't seem relevant to the conclusion I was making.
All right, this would have been something that the Cruz information, just for the benefit of the jury, relates to a particular day or evening that Mr. Dahmer spent with a gentleman or a military man by the name of Cruz, whether some others were present. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And did you ask him directly, did that happen, or discuss that with him?
Well, I did want to know if it happened. I guess I should clarify slightly. It is my belief, and I had said this yesterday, that there was a period of time where he was trying very hard not to commit murder, and that included the period of time in the Army in Florida when he'd come back home for a while to Ohio and then Milwaukee and so on. So had he committed a murder while in the Army, that would have not supported the way in which I was seeing it. He denied it, and again, although it looked a bit peculiar, I know of absolutely no evidence that he had. I do know he's a guy when he gets drunk and can get into fights and arguments. So I was concerned about it, but couldn't find evidence that indeed he had murdered.
I'm just curious, though, Doctor. He did deny to Dr. Dietz. He said it's just not true. What Cruz is saying is not true. Did he make the same statement to you, if you recollect?
Well, I don't know how to use those words, but he told me he hadn't murdered anybody while he was in the Army.
In terms of the background of this defendant, many times persons that are involved in a series of homicides, violent homicides, have individuals who themselves have been subjected to abuse as a youngster. Is that correct? Physical abuse?
Physical, emotional, sexual. That's
Sexual
correct.
abuse?
Yes, sir.
Did you find any evidence of physical abuse in Mr. Dahmer's background?
No, there was no physical abuse that I could find. It was a tumultuous home situation. Parents were having some difficulties. It ended in divorce. But, that happens in lots of families, unfortunately, and it doesn't, lead to necrophilia. So I looked at that, and although there were some things there, I wouldn't say that this was a terribly abused child by any means.
In terms of the actual physical surroundings, at least during his later youth and into high school, it appeared that he lived on a home on a 1.5 to 1 1/4 acre lot with woods and a pond. Is that correct? So, at least in terms of physical surroundings, they appeared to be pleasant. Would that be accurate?
Oh, yes. In fact, pictures had been taken. There were all sorts of sketches and so on. Because of the investigation in Ohio, it seemed to be a pleasant place. And I'm agreeing with you that I don't see anything unpleasant about his physical surroundings or anything terribly overwhelming that I would say reached a level of abuse.
And there was no evidence of sexual abuse by any adult against him as a youth. Is that correct?
Yeah, his father at one time had told a probation officer that at around age 8 he'd been abused, but that was subsequently denied. There was an incident at age 14 with a boy across the street who was, they were both about the same age, of some homosexual fondling, which Mr. Dahmer himself thinks was consensual and doesn't describe as traumatic. So I don't find evidence that he was sexually abused as a child.
In terms of the activity that he described, going down to the bathhouses and casually meeting people and so on, although that may be high-risk activity in terms of HIV, you as a psychiatrist do not see that as sick activity, do you?
Well, yes and no. I mean, going to the bathhouses I don't see as sick, had it just stayed as consenting homosexual activity. When it gets into doping people to try to have sex with them while they're asleep, then I think we're getting into something that starts to become sick.
In terms, did you have any discussion with the defendant as to what was in his mind as or right immediately before he undertook to kill these individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I was particularly interested, for example, in whether or not he wanted to see these people suffer. So I did go into some detail on that because part of the differential diagnosis was sadism. Was he increasingly more aroused as a result of the killing itself? He really just describes this as a continuation of them being in this sleep-like state and wanting then to continue the relationship and really taking precautions that they shouldn't suffer. I know that can sound bizarre with the terrible things he did, but in terms of what he's reporting about his state of mind, that's what he's telling.
So he did not undertake to torture. Would it be safe to say that it was, as these people expected, that they would become conscious, that they would then wish to leave, that by executing them as he did, by killing them as he did, they would continue to be available to him, and he could continue to take pleasure from that, from their availability and what sexual activities he might or might not undertake?
Yes, he was very much drawn towards the idea of sustaining both a sexual and kind of an intimate relationship even after they were no longer alive.
In terms of the alcohol, can you tell us what alcohol dependence is?
Well, again, there are various definitions, so I can tell you mine. I would certainly say that somebody that needs alcohol, just the words themselves, to function, gets up and has a sense of wanting to have it frequently, has difficulty refraining from it. Those would be some aspects of what I would see as alcohol dependence.
And would you agree that that may affect the capacity of an individual to refrain from certain activities, whether he takes in alcohol?
Sure, absolutely. One problem with being intoxicated is it impairs a person's judgment and impairs their ability to inhibit impulses. I think that certainly aggravated the problem in him, though, as I said earlier, it certainly isn't in and of itself by any means the entire explanation.
Have you found alcohol dependence to be an important factor in an evaluation of sexual deviancy?
Yes, and in fact, as you recall, I diagnosed him in terms of a secondary diagnosis as having alcoholism.
You did that when? You didn't do that in your initial report, am I correct?
Yes, you are correct. My initial report, as I understood it, was simply to make the point that he had a major mental disorder and that out of that particular disorder, he could be seen as not criminally responsible. Mr. Boyle had said that's all that's needed. It qualifies you to come to court and explain. So I put it in there. But certainly when I testified yesterday, I made it very clear that I was persuaded that alcoholism was indeed another diagnosis.
But you did not mention that in your initial submission to the court.
No, and in retrospect, I probably should have, but I didn't see that as the major issue. I still don't, but I think it's an aggravating problem.
With respect to Ernest Miller, did he tell you how he slayed Ernest Miller?
Okay, and again, I apologize. I haven't memorized the names of each person. If you can give me a little bit of information, I'd be glad.
Did he tell you that there's some individuals he said he strangled, some he said he strangled with a particular piece of equipment? Do you remember what that was?
Yeah, he either strangled people, he used a belt sometimes. There were times where he put a bag over the head and again, I apologize, and strangled him that way. There was one fellow, he started to wake up and he didn't have enough sleeping pills and he cut his throat.
That was Ernest Miller.
I assumed that that's what you were trying to get at.
Did you perceive the slaying of Mr. Hicks in the summer of 1978 as necrophilic behavior?
Yes, I saw that as an expression of his necrophilia. He had talked about having fantasies before that time, about having thoughts of sex with corpses. There'd been the dead animals and him being aroused by the kills that he found on the roadside. So I did feel that was an expression of his necrophilia.
Did he tell you that he had been aroused at some point by the road kills as he was working on the road kills?
He didn't use the word sexual arousal at that point. He talked about being very excited, curious. Certainly there was some sort of strong feelings that he was describing. He did not at that point talk about being sexually aroused, however.
Right. So he did not connect sexual arousement with the cutting of the dogs, is that correct?
No, he did not. But in looking at the big picture, the idea that he committed one murder for some reason having nothing to do with necrophilia and all the rest did, that to me doesn't make a lot of sense. But you're absolutely right that he doesn't describe it precisely that way when he talks about it.
After the slaying of Mr. Hicks, several months later, he went to the Ohio State University. Is that correct?
Yes, he ultimately dropped out. He had serious drinking problems. He'd taken some money to foster his alcoholism. That was one of the aspects that made it clear that why a diagnosis of alcoholism was also quite appropriate.
In terms of any sexual assaults, did he tell you under what circumstances he resided at the Ohio State University?
As I recall, he was in a dormitory. In fact, people began to get fed up with him and wanted him out of the room that he was in. But I don't recall anything further.
Certainly at Ohio State University, that's a large Midwestern land-grant university. One can safely estimate that there's in excess of 25,000 students, probably in Columbus. Am I correct
Yeah,
on
I'm
that?
familiar with it. It's a very, very large institution.
And that would have provided presumably thousands or certainly many hundreds of men physically attractive with the appropriate habitus and so on, attractive to Mr. Dahmer. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, if he was just looking to get involved in homosexual relations, I think he probably could have found some folks.
The evidence is clear, at least there's no reason to believe that in fact, he did not slay anyone apparently at that campus in those months. Is that correct?
Well, there have been careful investigations. As you know, people called from around the country thinking that maybe Dahmer had done this one or that. The police work has been extensive here and very, very impressive. And I have seen no evidence whatsoever that he committed a killing during that.
So whatever necrophilic motivation played a role with respect to the slaying of Mr. Hicks, he apparently controlled that while he was at the Ohio State University, exposed to many individuals that would have been attractive to him.
Yes, and as you recall, I felt that he had, I used that word, I guess, fight the good fight. He indicated he had throughout that period, and even in the Army and subsequently in Florida and so on, the urges, but that he was able, through fighting it, until the ambassador incident, he wakes up and finds the fellow dead, and then after that, things kind of were quite
He then went into the military and was in the military for in excess of some 2.5 years. Is that correct?
Yes, I think he was out a little bit earlier because of his alcoholism, but approximately 2.5 years.
And during that time, certainly he would have been exposed to hundreds of men that would have been attracted to him, physically attractive. Young men about his age, certainly many of them would have qualified as being attractive to him. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
And he lived in a barracks, and yet we know that there's no report and no reason to believe that he killed any of those men. Is that correct?
That's right. He had some arguments, got himself into trouble over sort of verbally arguing with officers and so on, but there's no evidence whatsoever that he killed anybody at that time.
And then he returned, and you said he then came home and went to West Allis, Wisconsin. Is that correct?
Well, no, that is not correct. He initially went to Florida. Again, his alcoholism got to it. In fact, he called his folks, and they had to pay for the plane ride, and he came home drunk on the plane. So he spent a period in Florida. He was living on benches for a while. He stayed briefly with a woman down there, but again, no sexual contact, and then came back to Ohio subsequently. I could be wrong, but I think it was about 6 months in Florida, but I could look it up if it's important.
In your direct examination, you had not touched on that Florida thing. I wish to touch on that. During that time, have you been in that area, the Collins Avenue area in Miami?
I've been in Miami, but I don't know it well enough to know if I've been in that
Is it
area.
basically a beach area? Are you aware of that?
Well, he described it that way because he talked of living on the beach, so I'm sure it must be, but I don't have any personal awareness of that area.
And living on the beach, he's certainly in Florida. He certainly would have been exposed to young men, attractive young men to him, with their shirts off and shorts and bathing suits and so on during that period of time, and yet there is no evidence that he undertook to slay anyone at that time. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, you're absolutely correct.
He must have maintained control during that time, did he not?
To the best of my knowledge, that's
He
correct.
was able to conform himself to the law from the time of the slaying of Mr. Hicks forward into West Allis. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, I agree with that.
And then the incident took place during that period in West Allis is when he talks about coming under the influence of his grandmother, making an attempt to commit himself religiously, and cutting back even in terms of masturbation substantially, and walking, as he described it, a straight and narrow path. Would that be
Yes,
my basic-
again, as we discussed during the period with the grandmother, there were some expressions of the necrophilia. We talked about the incident of taking the mannequin to grandma's home, the incident of attempting to dig up the grave. But in terms of killings, you're absolutely right in what you said.
Then in September of 1986, he was involved in an exposure incident in a park in the city of Milwaukee. Is that correct?
Yes, a couple of boys, young boys, I think around 13, came. They saw him. They sort of commented to him. They talked back and and forth to each other. So he had been exposing and masturbating there, and has admitted there have been perhaps 4 other times when he had exposed in a similar fashion.
And then from the period of the time from then forward into the latter part of November of 1987, he was either at the bathhouses, that terminated at some point in 1986 apparently, and then operating in the hotels, getting whatever sexual satisfaction he sought in those activities without slaying anyone. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And in terms of the slaying of Mr. Tuomi, it's difficult to determine actually what happened there, isn't it?
Well, some things are difficult, but I think it's clear it couldn't have been pre-planned because he had no escape plan. He had to kind of leave the body there, go out and get something to put it in and so on. So that does give credence to the idea that his intention had not been to kill him when he entered the hotel room, but subsequently, ultimately he did.
In terms of after the arrest, in terms of the indecent exposure, he was adjudicated, found guilty, and required as a condition of probation to secure counseling. Is that correct?
Yes, he saw Dr. Rosen, I believe, during that time.
And during that time, she saw him at least several times prior to the November 1987 hotel incident, where she made a conscientious effort, it appears from looking at the records, to influence Mr. Dahmer. Is that correct? To reach out, to give him some type of help.
She did. As you know, Mr. Dahmer's father wrote the judge and had some concerns about that treatment. Mr. Dahmer was not cooperative, would sometimes sit quietly, not even speak to her, and on occasion turned his back. So I don't think he was involved in therapy. In fact, I wouldn't have allowed that if I was his therapist. But be that as it may, he was, in theory, in therapy at that period of time. I guess that's the way.
Certainly, at your clinic, you require persons to accept responsibility. You would not tolerate at your clinic. I mean, you feel when they start with your clinic, you say, look, we'll try to help you, but you've got responsibility to abide by the law.
Well, I expect denial and rationalization of someone like him who clearly had been involved with a child, had an alcohol problem, and wasn't wanting to talk to me and was in denial, kept that up. I'd tell him, look, I'm not putting up with this. We're going to get you in a residential treatment center. We're going to force you to look at what's going on here. I wouldn't have sat back and let him sit in a chair for an hour and not responded to that.
Subsequently there, too, several individuals were slain. Is that correct? After the November incident, he slew Doc Stater in January and Mr. Guerrero in March. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir. After the incident with Mr. Toomey and the ambassador, he continued to slay, and as things went along, ultimately got to the point where it was coming more and more frequently and so on.
In April of 1988, he invited Mr. Flowers to his residence at the grandmother's house. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
He's given conflicting statements on what his intentions were, at least from my examination of the record. Is that your opinion as well?
It is, and my opinion is that had it not been for grandmother and had he not fallen asleep before he killed Mr. Flowers, had he been able to do it, I believe he would have, but I think the circumstances there prevented that from happening.
In his final statement to you, because we know there were conflicting statements, did he tell you that he intended to kill Mr. Flowers when he discussed it with you, or did he deny that he intended to kill Mr. Flowers?
I don't remember if I used Mr. Flowers as an example, but I made the statement to him that my sense was that the people that he didn't kill, he really didn't kill because something had come along to prevent it, and he agreed with me that that was basically the situation.
So that, I'm sorry, you were telling him what your impression is, or were you asking him what...
We were talking back and forth, and so at times I'd ask questions. This was late on, and I was making some observations. And I made the observation, there's this pattern, you've got all these people there, and then there's the incident with Flowers, and I had read it carefully, and I said, is it the case that you wouldn't... it was a leading question, if that's what you want to know. I did say, it's my impression that he probably would have been killed too had it not been for the fact he'd fallen asleep, grandmother was there, and so on. That's how I recall phrasing it, and he did not argue with me on that interpretation. But I did lead him in terms of how
It would have been better on reflection to have asked him just what your intention was with Mr. Flowers rather than to lead him as you did. Am I correct?
Probably, but I was by that point quite persuaded about the diagnosis, about the issues, and regardless of what he'd answered at that point, it wasn't going to change my mind on the major issues before us today. But I think I'd concede if I had to do it again, I'd probably be less leading.
Right. At any rate, whatever scenario you believe, the grandmother, and Mr. Flowers will testify, I know you've not had the benefit of his testimony, but Mr. Flowers will testify that even as he came in, although he didn't see the grandmother called out and said, "Is that you?" to Jeffrey.
Yes, I mean, I've read what I haven't talked to him directly, but I've read what he has said to the authorities, and so I'm quite aware of that.
At any rate, when Mr. Dahmer discovered, or there was reason to believe the grandmother knew about it, he determined, at least he clearly did not kill Mr. Flowers. Is that correct?
He did not, under those circumstances where grandmother had seen and so on, kill him.
He was sentenced on the May 23, 1989, in terms of the secondary sexual assault that he performed on that juvenile. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And again, legally, that's what was defined as having happened. But clearly, he was again attempting to dope this youngster and so on. Thank God, in that case, the young man was able to leave.
All right. Let me address that. The Flowers incident occurred in April of 1988. And the incident with the young man, we have a difficulty here because I cannot lawfully give his name. And we've referred to him to the jury as CS, an incident involving CS in our, he was 13 at the time. He will be testifying, but his name, again, will not be provided to the public.
Glad you
or his face. So
told me that.
I'd ask you, you know who it is of whom I'm speaking.
Yes, sir, but I will be careful to.
All right. Let's refer to him as CS. He was a 13-year-old boy walking on the street in the vicinity of an apartment that Mr. Dahmer had secured near 24th and Wells. He was approached on the street by Mr. Dahmer. Mr. Dahmer asked him to come back to the apartment. He said he would photograph him. The boy reported going back, and at that time, we have the serving of the mixture of a cup that apparently had some of the particular drug that was used for drugging, and he induced the young man to partially disrobe. The young man said that Dahmer intervened and disrobed him further and touched his penis. Is that a brief summary of the, at least the undisputed or undenied activity?
Yes, sir, that is.
At some time later, in different reports, Mr. Dahmer would never advert to the touching, but do you believe that's what happened?
Yes, I'm aware that Mr. Dahmer has at times denied it, and I believe that the version that you've described is like almost certainly the accurate version.
The young man stated, and apparently this is what transpired, that he became alarmed and he had drank some of the coffee, got up, started to leave. Mr. Dahmer gave him $50, and he left the dwelling, went to his home. Parents saw that he was groggy, transported him to a hospital, and it came to the attention of the police. Is that a basically fair summary?
That's correct.
My question is this. Mr. Dahmer has said, as I'm sure you are aware, to the police and to others, that it was not his intent to kill this young man, indeed saying that it was his intent to go to work, that he was just going to take the pictures and do whatever else, but that he didn't intend to kill this young man and wouldn't have killed this young man. That's basically what he has said, at least to some sources. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Do you believe that?
No, sir, no more than I believe that he would not have killed a number of these other people if only they would have stayed. I don't think his motive was to keep them there alive. I don't believe that.
And he told what did he tell you about that? Did he say he intended to kill CS or that he did not intend to kill CS?
And whether he's just lying to himself or misrepresenting to me, he states that the intention wasn't to kill him, but as I said, I agree with you. I believe his intention would have been.
I didn't say that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I
agree with the version that you presented. I didn't mean to suggest you necessarily agreed with it.
Well, do you know, did he tell anyone that he intended to kill? You know, you've seen Dr. Becker's notes, I take it. He told Dr. Becker, another psychologist for the defense, that he did not, in my recollection.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, and I've reviewed a lot of material, so I hope I haven't missed anything, but to the best of my knowledge, he didn't tell anybody that he intended to kill.
Would you look at your notes where it shows his response to your questions about that? Would you check your notes?
Oh, gosh.
You know who I'm speaking of?
Yes, I absolutely do. And yeah.
It occurred on September 27, 1988.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, September 26th.
If it's all right with you, I've made some summary notes. It would just be quicker to find. Is that rather than my original? Is that?
What, you mean
okay?
Subsequent?
Yeah, I mean, as I went back through things and looked at all this data, I jotted down some other things.
I'd rather go to your original notes, if you don't mind. I don't know if you went chronologically, but it would have been September 26, 1988, if you progressed chronologically with him.
I went chronologically when I summarized, but I didn't necessarily not jump around at times when I went through it. Well, I don't see that I made a specific note as to what he said on that, so I would.
So you're going by recollection?
Yeah, it may be in here, and if I had a lot of time, I don't want to take all that. I don't find a note in here and looking through, so I'm going.
Doctor, are you sure you asked him about it?
Pardon me?
Are you sure you asked him about it? About the synthesis phone incident? I'm sorry.
We talked about the incident, the difficulty. I'm sure I asked him about the incident. I know you're not trying to be smart with me. I've reviewed so much material now for so many hours that it's difficult at times to remember the exact details of what he might have given and what was in here. And as I said, my interest was getting the big picture. I'm absolutely sure I asked him about the incident. Whether I asked the question specifically as you're directing here, it's difficult at this point to know that for sure.
In any event, he had the young man there. The jury, this was in 1988, and the jury will see that young man testify. In terms, if I were told to tell you that he was a somewhat slight individual, will you accept that? You never saw this.
No, I'm very aware of his appearance and so on. That was relevant in many ways, and I'm quite aware of that.
And Mr. Dahmer had him there in the apartment. This is in September of '88. He had already given him, apparently, he was to later say it was an accident, the drug, but you believe he had drugged him, do you not?
Oh, absolutely, I believe he had.
There's no question, because the young man was drugged, had to be taken to the hospital.
Right, he said there was residue on the cup because he'd been taking some pills for sleep, and maybe because the guy drank from the same cup. That's
not true. We know, and he later said, but in any event, he has always said he did not intend to kill this young man, and when this young man got up to leave, the young man is just beginning to feel this. The door is closed. It's an apartment. No one is present in the apartment. Mr. Dahmer is presumably as tall and as physically well-built as he is today. And there's a very slight young man, somewhat slight young man. And Mr. Dahmer does not physically set upon him, but permits him to leave the apartment. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah, he doesn't physically set upon him, and the youngster is able to leave. That is correct.
You're going to have to use another initials. He's sentenced in May of 1989 to the House of Correction. Is that correct?
Yes, the initial, right. There was an interval, and the actual sentencing was in May. That's correct.
That was, and the House of Correction, for you, just for your knowledge, I know you would know, is a dormitory-style building, a block or so from here. It's a converted hospital. And
that's. I was just trying to get the dates clear because, as I mentioned yesterday, there was a killing between the time he was charged and when he was sentenced. And I was trying to be sure of the sentencing date. And yes, that was the sentencing.
Over the next 14-month period, now 9 or 10 of those months, he was a prisoner at the House of Correction.
Well, he was, yes, a prisoner, but on work release, so it wasn't that he didn't have access.
During the day or during his shift, which was third shift from presumably 11 to 7 or midnight to 8, in that interval, he was out of the House of Correction for some period of time before that, as it's not a great distance to the work site, presumably left 15 or so minutes before, walked to the work site, worked, and presumably would be back 15 or 20 minutes after the work shift.
That's correct, and also had some passes for holidays and so on.
All right, and was where he didn't have to respond back.
Right.
And during that time, although he was released during the day and had these occasional passes, during that period, roughly from May of 1989 to May of 90, roughly a year, he did not kill anyone. Is that correct?
That's right. As I mentioned, he had kind of gruesome, a head in the locker where he worked while he was on that work release, but to the best of my knowledge, he didn't actually kill anybody during that time.
That was a skull, wasn't it?
Yes, I'm sorry, absolutely.
That's my recollection.
Right.
During that time, in that interval, he did some visiting at the Unicorn Club in the city of Chicago. Were you aware of that? The bathhouse in Chicago?
There was an incident where he himself was assaulted. That may be the one you're talking about. I know he did do that.
Well, but he made a number of visits. I don't know if you have that information or not, but he made
I
a
don't
number of visits.
remember that. I remember one time he didn't get back from work release because he'd gone off with someone who'd victimized him and assaulted him. I really don't recall that I was aware of a number of visits to the bathhouses during that time.
In any event, he started the probationary period and undertook to meet with a Donna Chester. Is that correct?
This was his probation officer, I believe you're talking about. Yes, that's correct.
And she urged, you were provided those notes, I assume. She offered him help. She urged him to contact a gay hotline to get some help where he would meet people he was saying he was unhappy with his situation, that he said to her he was sexually drawn to men.
That's right. She'd referred him, I think, to DePaul for some alcohol treatment, had sent him on various times to see doctors. He talked a lot about depression. She'd encouraged him to get antidepressants and was really trying very hard to get him into a situation where he could receive help that she felt would have been appropriate.
He appears to have rejected that. Although he physically complied to an extent, he appears, would it be fair to summarize to say that he did not seem to be willing to accept that help?
Well, it'd be fair to say that often he seemed more to be going through the motions. There were times when he seemed genuinely distressed. He did himself, I think, at times want antidepressants. He was started on Nardil, some other things, but he really didn't follow through in a consistent fashion.
He was prescribed Nardil, but there's no evidence that I'm aware of that he ever...
Right. He then decided, he said he was hurting, he needed it, and then he kind of decided maybe he didn't need it. I think he didn't even take it subsequently.
In July of 1990, he has now got another apartment. He's been out. It's been a year since a year and several months since the House Correction, since the sentencing date. Another minor came to his apartment. Again, I'm not at liberty to give his name. We've referred to him as LP.
This is the man who, again, complained to the authorities that he had been assaulted while there by Mr. Dahmer, hit on the head with the hammer.
That's the individual.
Right. Yes, okay.
Mr. Dahmer relates that he had met this man at the 219 Club. This young man, 15, I think the young man was at the time. Yes, 15. Went to took him to his apartment, had secured a mallet. He did not have the particular drug available, had secured a mallet that he intended to dispatch this man with the mallet, apparently, or to dispatch him to unconsciousness with the mallet. Took some pictures, got him to lay over on his stomach, and then struck him with the mallet, apparently intending to render him unconscious. However, the young man was not rendered unconscious. Turned around, there was not great detail on a physical struggle, but certainly a confrontation, some discussion, back and forth, sharp words, and eventually Mr. Dahmer permitted that young man to leave. Is that correct? To leave his apartment?
Well, he kept trying to get him to stay. He did let him go. The guy ends up coming back. There's a whole series of events, but the essence of what you're saying is certainly correct.
And the young man came back, and I believe the next day, at least Mr. Dahmer states he came back the next day. Mr. Dahmer had apparently, do you believe that when he struck him with the mallet that Mr. Dahmer's intent was eventually to dispatch this young man?
Yes, I believe his intent was to kill him.
Mr. Dahmer's statement is, however, after they talked, they had further discussion, Mr. Dahmer decided not to kill him. Would that be an accurate summary?
Yes, as I mentioned, I was aware of some of these situations and did not believe that when Mr. Dahmer said he wasn't intending to kill, I didn't believe that, as we discussed a few minutes ago.
Mr. Dahmer apparently, we've touched on a number of the incidences, Flowers, the two juveniles. He also has said that there are other people came to the apartment, the truck driver you talked about, other individuals that are unnamed and unknown, that came to the grandmother's house, that came to the apartment, and were not slain. Is that correct?
Yes, he has said that.
And certainly in terms of when he would meet someone, he never undertook to attack anyone on the street, did he?
Well, as we pointed out, he got drunk and got in some fights, but I don't think he attempted ever to kill anybody on the street.
In other words, although he did say on occasion he would try to pick someone up at the gay club. Sometimes he was successful, sometimes he wasn't. those nights that he wasn't successful, say that he had ground the pills and intended to have someone come there, when he could not induce anyone to voluntarily come there, there is no evidence that he set upon anyone on the street or in a mall or anywhere else, is there?
Right. I mean, I know we're excluding Mr. Hicks because that was outside of an apartment, but obviously excluding him, and you're aware of that. You're absolutely right.
No, Mr. Hicks, he took to his home, didn't he? He didn't attack him on the street. He picked him up.
No, I'm sorry. Excuse me. You're absolutely correct. I was thinking of the incident where he had the sawed-off bat and was intending to go after the jogger. That would have clearly been in public. Excuse me.
But I think if you checked your notes, if you made a note, everyone else says, all the other doctors, I believe, will indicate that he said he intended to render him unconscious, but not to kill the jogger.
Yeah, well, that one I definitely made notes, but, I don't think that's a terribly important point.
But in terms of all these persons that he killed, he first made sure, however he attracted them, that he got them into the apartment first.
Yes,
in other words, he maintained such control that even on the nights that he was disappointed and could not induce anyone to come, he didn't thereafter start prowling the streets intending to get someone on a street corner and kill him.
He did not attempt to kill anybody, to the best of my knowledge, on a street corner, to use your words.
In terms of the David Thomas matter, and that's the one where he has said to the police that he did not intend to have sex with him, or did not have sex with him and killed him because he was going to get angry or pissed off. You believe he did intend to have sex with him and did have sex with him?
Yes, sir.
Right. And we've already talked about Mr. Flowers and the fact that he did not proceed to kill Mr. Flowers. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Right. Mr. Dahmer at no time had any command, never told you about any command hallucinations to kill anyone, did he?
No, as I told you, I looked very closely at whether a disease like schizophrenia played a part in this, so that I spent a good deal of time on. No, he did not tell me anything of that sort.
And he was under no delusions that he was somehow conscientiously required to slay anyone.
Again, I looked at that very closely. I was concerned whether he was delusional. My conclusion was that he was not.
And in terms of offers of help, even before Mr. Tuomi, there had been an effort to extend help to him through at least Dr. Rosen. Is that correct?
Yes, again, his father had complained because both sex offender treatment and alcohol treatment had been identified as important when he went into prison. In fact, it was said that he would be dangerous if he didn't get it, and the father wrote to the judge complaining. But nonetheless, the treatment that had been made available to him, he was in denial. He was often not cooperative, as we've discussed earlier.
In terms of do you see these as prepared crimes?
Again, sir, I don't mean to evade your question. I'm not sure what you mean by prepared.
That these were planned, the offenses were planned?
Yeah, I believe they're, and again, I'm hesitating because I know you don't like some of the analogies I use, but I believe they're planned in the same way that driven behavior often involves the behavior being preceded by thoughts and fantasies and urges to do it. And so in the sense, the ideas of how to do it were running through his mind and so on, certainly in that sense they were planned. They weren't impulsive where he wasn't thinking about it, he just went by somewhere and suddenly he did it.
In other words, he would exercise certainly in deferring those nights that he couldn't find anybody. He may have gotten the pills ground for the cough or the cup, but if he couldn't find anybody, he would control himself and say, go back to his apartment. Nobody's going to kill nobody tonight.
I absolutely use the word you use of deferred. I believe there was a drive associated. I won't belabor it. I've explained it and people can accept it or not. But certainly he was capable of deferring in the way that you've just described.
And in fact, there's evidence that he did that through substantial year periods. So,
yes, there's evidence that he could defer this and did defer this many, many times.
In terms of a plan, a set-up control plan, he lied to doctors to get the drugs, did he not?
Absolutely.
And in terms of he would, at least in not all the cases, but a number of the cases, he prepared ground the drugs in a cup he indicated before he went out to secure a victim. Is that correct?
Oh, it was absolutely his intention, in my opinion, to drug these people, that this was part of it. It wasn't that idea just struck him at a particular moment.
And he would target people, particularly at the bars, and wait until closing time. To the other, I've not been in bars in Baltimore, but I assume in many bars where I have visited different parts of the country, at closing time, there seems to be a hubbub out on the street, and people are talking and partying and shouting goodbyes. There's a bit of a hubbub.
Yeah, he would cruise the bars, but most of the actual persuasion of people to come with him was at the late hours towards the time when the bars were getting close to closing. That's correct.
And then he would target particular individuals, approach them. Sometimes they'd come, sometimes they didn't. When they would come, he would have the coffee ready. He'd prepare coffee with the particular pills, and they might first have sex voluntarily, some not, and then he would give them the coffee. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, in terms of your targeting, certainly earlier on, it was very much trying to find someone that fit the fantasy physical physique and so on. Towards the end, he became far less discriminate and seemed prepared that just about anyone he could persuade would do. So it kind of changed a bit over time, but I'm not going against the essence of what you're saying.
All right. Have you examined the physiques of the particular men? The jury have seen the pictures. They seem to be young men, somewhat attractive young men. Their bodies are not shown, but...
Yeah, well, unfortunately, in a very grotesque way, I have, because I looked at the pictures, and I didn't see all of them, but because some were skeletons, but I saw a number of them.
In terms of basically, they were not what you'd call unattractive individuals, am I right?
No, yes, sir, I believe you would, that is a correct statement.
When he would return with them, when he brought them in a cab, he would alight from that cab several blocks away from the home, did he not?
Generally, that was so, yes.
And did he tell you that did you ask him, was that for the express purpose of ensuring that where you got out of the cab would not be subject to being traced?
I didn't ask him that specific question, but I certainly was interested in whether he was taking steps not to get caught. And it's very clear to me that he was. Now, that doesn't necessarily address whether he could control it in the first place, but certainly he did not want to be caught, and he was taking lots of precautions, perhaps up until the very end, where he was really quite careless, but taking precautions not to get caught.
At the very end, you did not hear the testimony of a gentleman that spoke here named Tracy Edwards. I want to assure you at the very end, they did get out of a cab several blocks from the apartment. That was the last...
No, I wasn't talking about the getting out of the cab, but just in terms of trying not to get caught, of bodies lying around two at a time, of leaving them there, of the odor being strong. All of that was what I was referring to.
What I'm saying, though, Doctor, the fact is, in terms of the cab, even at the very last incident, they get out of the cab several blocks away from them.
Yes, I do not mean to be disagreeing with you that at all. That's absolutely correct.
And then he would induce them to drink. When he'd get them in the apartment, he would induce them to take the drink. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And all these killings occurred in an environment that he controlled, either his apartment, the Hicks slaying, the slayings in the grandmother's house, with the one exception of Toomey, and there are questions about how that occurred or whether that was even intentional. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I wouldn't quibble with any of that.
Pardon?
I'm sorry, I said I wouldn't quibble with any of that.
And he would then wait until the drug took effect before he would undertake the slaying.
Yes, it was very important to him that these people not be conscious, that they not be tortured in any way. He repeated many, many times.
And then he had the equipment available to destroy the bodies.
Yes, this had become a sick ritual. He would stand naked in the bathroom and so on. This was all something that just got repeated over and over again in a very ritual.
Did you ask him why he would stand naked?
Again, I'm trying to sort out, what came exactly from what I asked and so on. What I'm aware of, if that's acceptable, is that he denied being sexually aroused, because I was interested in that issue. He was saying that he didn't want to get blood on his clothes so that people would notice. I don't remember for sure if he told me or if I got that in other ways, but that's my understanding of what was going on.
And this was his way of disposing bodies. He didn't have a car, did he?
No, sir, he did not.
He couldn't take the body out 5 miles out of town and get rid of it, could he?
He certainly couldn't have driven in a car. He didn't have a car.
Right. And he couldn't have started dropping bodies in the alley behind the house. The police had 2 or 3 bodies in the alley. They'd be saying, we've got a killer here right in this neighborhood, and that would have drawn intense suspicion on the immediate area. Is that true?
Yeah, I agree with that. Again, I think, he was also saving parts, and there was a ritualistic thing, but I don't want to debate that with you. I agree with what you're saying.
And the cutting up of the bodies was his disposal method, not having a car, not wishing to leave them outside the back door. He had to dispose of the bodies, and indeed, in discussion with you, he described that as part of the disposal effort. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's why he got the barrel to acidify the larger bones so they would be mushy. He could put them in a bag or flush them down the toilet or put them in a bag and dump them in the dumpster, as he did with a number of the bodies. Is that correct?
Yes, again, he had often done other things with them that I don't want to go into detail, but certainly the part of being able to dispose them in that fashion and doing it repeatedly in that same way over and over and over again, that's absolutely correct.
Did you compare the particular that were in the particular barrel in terms to see whether it was basically the bodies of the last 4 persons, or whether he kept the skull, certainly, but in terms of the barrel, the persons in the barrel, well, actually the last 4 people, is that correct, that he had slain?
Yeah, again, that wasn't terribly critical to the conclusions I was trying to decide about, but in reading all the reports and so on, I become aware of who was in the barrel and so on.
All right, and did you and that's true of the heads that had not been defleshed. That was also true. It was the last 4 people that he had slain. Is that correct?
Again, I'm going by memory, but I'm sure you're being accurate, and I'm certain that must be correct.
What I'm saying is that some of that he was saying, he's given testimony that in terms of getting tired, not taking any particular pleasure in getting rid of those bodies, that it was taking time, and that was part of his disposal program. The point I'm trying to make, Doctor, is that he didn't have a car to drop the bodies 5 miles away. He couldn't drag them down the street, and he chose to get rid of them by dismembering them, defleshing them, and getting rid of it in that fashion. Is that true?
Yeah, just so you know, you explained your thing. I just hesitate a bit, and again, I'm not trying to learn here everything I might want to learn if I'm going to, publish a paper on necrophilia, and I have some suspicions, therefore, that this ritual of spending hours over and over and doing it the same and doing it in this bizarre way may not have been only for purpose of getting rid of the body, but may be tied in to his disease. But I didn't go into that because it's not important in terms of these issues.
You're describing it as a ritual. Was he doing?
Well, he's standing naked, the body's there, he's following in a very set fashion, he's got it almost stereotyped each time. So it's ritualistic in the same that it's repeated stereotype behavior.
He stands naked. If you're going to cut up bodies to get rid of them, and you decide you don't want blood on your clothes, you take off your clothes and you cut up the bodies, don't you?
Okay, yes, and again, please, I don't want to be argumentative. Let me just be clear. As a psychiatrist, because I'm examining him that way, I'm wondering whether, in addition to getting rid of him to dispose of the body, it might be tied in somewhat to his disease. It wasn't, given all that I've already seen, and I was clear on the diagnosis and clear on my findings, necessary to pursue it. I'm not trying to take away from you that he was disposing of him, absolutely. But I'm trying to be candid that as a psychiatrist seeing this, I certainly am also going to wonder whether there's something more to it as well. That's all I'm trying to say.
Did he tell you that he conducted rituals during the disposition of these bodies?
No, sir, he did not, and I don't want to miss.
Did he, in fact, deny that he engaged in any rituals?
Well, he didn't deny that he engaged in rituals, but as I said, I as a psychiatrist wondered about that as being ritualistic. I am not saying he said it, and I'm not taking for a minute away that he was also, regardless of whether it was a ritual, trying to dispose of these. He didn't want to get caught, and this was a way of trying to be sure he wouldn't get caught.
Did you flatly ask him, Mr. Dahmer, did you engage in any ritualistic activities there in the apartment?
No, sir. As I said, I was trying to share with you what I was thinking, and I'm not trying to deflect it, but I did not ask him that. And I'm not saying it was that. I was just trying to be complete in my response.
Do many times persons with a strong paraphilic grip involve themselves in ritual as part of killing?
Oh, gosh, ritual is part of killing. I mean, certainly there are ritualistic killings. So that is out there in the literature, perhaps one of the reasons I'm thinking about it. But I'm trying very hard not to disagree with you, because I do agree with you that one of the things he was trying very hard to do was not to get caught. I'm not trying, I don't want to take that away, because I agree with you on that.
But in my terms is this, in terms of absolutely each time doing the killing the same way, we know he didn't do that, did he?
No, there were variations in how he went about that.
And many paraphilically committed people and engaging in violence will repeat in an exact ritualistic way, will they not, how they kill the person?
Well, they might do it exactly. I wouldn't go along with you that this wasn't the repetition of the same theme over and over and over again. That was certainly there, of having them alive, having sex with them, having them in a transition state, having them dead. So the theme was very ritualistic, but I do want to agree with you that the specific details varied somewhat one from the other.
Sometimes the hand, sometimes he used a strap. One time he used a knife. A number of times he said he didn't want to kill him at all, that they died from drilling.
Absolutely, and we discussed that, and I agreed with you on that.
And you have testified on occasion that, particularly in the rape case, that how a man, speaking particularly of the Kirk case, how a man repeats a ritualistic in a grip, will repeat it in exactly the same way, say the same words, go through the same act, want the same if it's requiring the woman to perform fellatio, do it in the same fashion, humiliate with the same words. We do not see that exact replication, death after death with Mr. Dahmer, do we?
Well, again, people may not know, Mr. Kirk was another case I testified in. There were some similarities and major differences. Certainly, Mr. Kirk had nothing to do with necrophilia.
But in terms of, you laid some import, did you not, on that the modus operandi was exactly the same, even words involved, procedures involved?
I think, and again, I hadn't expected to talk about the Kirk case, but it was probably a little closer in terms of concrete repetitiveness in the Kirk case than here. I think that's correct.
In terms of, I want to call your attention to after the Hicks slaying. He described what he did. Eventually, he dismembered, put them in a garbage bag, and undertook to drive to the apparently a dump in the area. He was stopped by police.
Yes,
you recall that?
Given a ticket. It's terrible irony for crossing.
Did they at first think he was driving while intoxicated?
Yeah, he was apparently quite nervous, as we can now put it together. He tells us, and he had the body at that time in bags in the back of the car, and the police stopped him. They even looked and asked him what was in the bags, and he said he had some garbage he hadn't gotten rid of. He explained he was up late because he'd been worried about his parents' divorce, and again, the poor officer couldn't have known this, but he ended up getting a ticket for driving on the left side of the road, and he was allowed to leave.
And he maintained, here is a man 18 who was just killed the day before a man, has the body in the back seat in garbage bags, a police flashlight. He's stopped by the police. It's in the early morning hours, as I recollect, 2 or 3 in the morning, stopped by police. They light up the back that contains the bags with a flashlight, and he maintains enough coolness to persuade them that nothing is wrong and to persuade them to leave him to go on. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
In terms of the incident involving did you read the sentencing transcript when he was sentenced in the second-degree sexual assault on the young man?
If it was provided to me, I read it because I read everything was provided. I don't recall offhand. If you want to jog my memory by telling me a bit more, I can tell you what it sounds.
Did he stand in court when summoned by the judge? Did he stand in court and persuade the judge that he intended to live well, that he was going to do the right thing, and articulately persuade the judge that he should get probation, even though he had already killed at least 3 men?
Yeah, I wasn't provided that, but I know that he had someone help him in writing a letter where he wanted to get out early from work release, talking about learning his lesson and that he never do it again. So I got that sort of information from that letter, but I don't think I saw the actual speech he might have made when he was sentenced.
Would you like to hear that?
Well, I mean, if it's a matter I like or not, if you feel it's important, I'll be glad to listen and answer your questions. I'm sorry, sir. Could someone get me a glass of water, too, for a moment? I apologize. Yes, please. I'm sorry. You don't have to wait for that, but
fine. This is now, he is being sentenced on the second-degree sexual assault. And the date is March, strike that, May 23rd, 1989.
Yes. One of those kind of breaks, nature breaks.
Okay. Court's in recess.
Everybody, please rise.